And now I'm delighted to welcome our panel to help us get smarter on a topic, this topic of energy and security. It's one that I've been thinking about longer than most of the folks on my next panel have been around, so we're looking for new, cool ideas. This is a complex topic, lots of shades of gray, but it's very essential. I'm joined today by Jennifer Gordon, Managing Editor and Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council Global Energy Center. And I'm Paul Saunders, whom I mentioned earlier in today's program, President of the Energy Innovation Reform Project, and also Senior Fellow in the U.S. Foreign Policy, or Senior Fellow in U.S. Foreign Policy at the Center for the National Interest. And Kerrigan, President of the Small Business and Entrepreneurship Council. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining us. Jennifer, let me ask you, you wrote recently that the COVID-19 pandemic has caused a demand shock and coincided with a supply shock in oil and gas markets. I was intrigued. Tell me more.
So in March and April of this year, basically global transportation stopped. People weren't using their cars, people weren't flying, and there was no demand. And at the same time, there was also the Saudi-Russian oil price war, which, now kind of given everything else that's happened since then, I think we maybe tend to forget or gloss over, but that also had, I think, a big impact. So you have these two phenomena occurring, basically at the same time, and, just excess amounts of natural gas and oil, while at the same time you have, essentially no demand. So I think that, that occurred, and then, here we are now. It
was a big deal. I mean, jump over to Karen for a minute. I mean, I remember it as like all of us were looking at the markets, and we had never looked at these kind of markets before, most of us, and we saw this going on. Many of your members, Karen, are business owners, small business owners in the oil, energy, and gas sector. Were they hit? Did this hit them like a tsunami?
Well, any type of disruption such as this is going to have a disproportionate impact, on the smaller players in the market. They just don't have the resources and the capital, to weather, these types of disruptions as some of the larger players in the industry do. And I have to say that, small to mid-sized businesses actually dominate the U.S. energy sector. For example, in the oil and natural gas extraction sector, 89% of those businesses have fewer than 20 employees, and 96% have fewer than 100 employees. So every single sector really is dominated by small businesses, and like everything else, they are disproportionately impacted, by this. So that's why, we believe that there has to be consistency in policy, pro-investment policies, and the opportunity to continue to export energy abroad in order to support these businesses and to keep them in the industry, because they are the innovators that are leading to more efficiency and cleaner technology.
Karen, before I jump to Paul to kind of give us the geostrategic fix on all this, but I want to, go a little bit deeper with your members and those that are out there, particularly with the realm of what I just asked Congressman Flores, because you and I have known each other a long time, and I did not know. I mean, my family's from Bartlesville, Oklahoma. That's where Phillips 66 was, now ConocoPhillips. I'm used to big companies. I didn't know that there was such a membership of these smaller and mid-sized firms engaged in the business. We've moved from a period of energy dependence to now one of energy dominance or energy independence in America, how has that changed the sandbox? How has it changed the world that your members see? Has it made it better? Has it made it worse? How much is energy independence a benefit for your members?
Oh, it's made it much better. For small businesses that actually use energy, which is all of them, more consistent and affordable prices is just good for them from a certainty perspective, from a growth perspective. They can plan more, hire more, invest more. So that type of certainty is important for all businesses. The other piece is just where we're doing energy development now in a lot of these communities, it's an economic driver that brings opportunities to not only the small energy companies in this sector, but also the many, many small businesses who actually are built and created around, around energy development. So it's been a game changer for businesses generally. And there's just more opportunity for growth and also for innovation. And the growth has just been spectacular, too, for diversity in the industry. I mean, where there's opportunity, where there's growth, where there's low barriers to entry, you do have more diversity in the industry, women and minority entrepreneurs. And that diversity is critical to innovation and our energy future.
Well, thank you so much for that. Paul, I mentioned earlier on the show that you and I were both with the Nixon Center for National Interest, and one of the annual rituals was to look at America's core national security interests. What was worth going and deploying military force to achieve or attain? And it used to be oil and energy was always on that list. What's the circumstance as you see it today?
Well, Steve, I suspect that oil and energy still are on the list, and it's great to be producing as much oil and gas as the United States is domestically. That has huge benefits for our economy. It has huge benefits, jobs, tax revenues, innovation. Of course, we already talked about all of that is terrific. As a practical matter, though, we're still part of a global oil market, and to the extent that there are disruptions somewhere that drive up prices, that can have pretty profound consequences for the United States. But certainly, again, we have new possibilities now that we never really thought about in the past. The Trump administration has been very active promoting U.S. natural gas exports to a number of our key allies. I would particularly single out South Korea, but clearly also the parallel effort in Europe. And again, there's no question that being able to produce as much oil as we have been able to, although obviously that has taken a pretty big hit over the last few months. But being able to do that, it's also a huge benefit. I think the key distinction that I would make, and you brought up earlier in the conversation with Congressman Flores, some of Russia's conduct. The challenge that the United States has, of course, is that we're a democracy and a market economy. And for a country like Russia, which has an authoritarian system of government, it's a little bit easier to use its energy resources as an instrument of influence. When you have a democracy and we don't have a system where the government can order energy companies, to sell here or not sell there, it requires certainly a lot more subtlety and sophistication to use that effectively.
Let me ask you, Paul, you're involved in a new outfit that I need to learn more about, the Energy Innovation Reform Project. And so I'm assuming that you're looking at the kind of broad energy sphere of what needs to be done out there. And it'd be interesting what the dimensions are. And I'll say, when we did this show last week, we had Representative Vicente Gonzalez on. He's simultaneously the co-chair of the Oil and Gas Caucus in the House and also the Renewables Caucus. Is there a way, because this is often the tension out there, how do you get an appreciation for the oil and gas dimensions, balanced with environmental concerns in a smart way, also looking at the progression, as Bill Flores just talked about, to carbon neutral solutions and to other energy solutions. So is that what your center is fixing?
Well, that's certainly a big issue that we're trying to work on. And, there are clearly a variety of linkages. Just as a departure point, I would say that a healthy fossil fuel industry that creates all kinds of jobs and tax revenue and everything else can be a huge force for innovation, actually, in energy. The investment that the companies make, the taxes that they pay to the U.S. government that, taxpayers can then turn around and channel into innovation or other approaches. So, certainly I think there's a big role for that industry in this transition, no question. And as far as our work, we're working very hard, looking at policies to try to promote innovation, and especially ways that we can bring both parties together to move forward on this. And, I'd particularly point as an example of that to an op-ed piece that I think a lot of people may not have seen in January this year in USA Today by Representative David McKinley, who's the chairman of the Coal Caucus and from West Virginia, a Republican, and Congressman Kurt Schrader, a Democrat from Oregon, who jointly have outlined, I think, a terrific framework for compromise and a pathway forward for the power sector.
Well, thank you. Let me ask Jennifer and Karen a question about what Paul was getting to, which is economic vitality, taxes. There's this, fascinating thing I've been fascinated by parts of the country that essentially were nearly dead, or at least defunct. Some of them ended up becoming big zones for activity, in fracking and bringing on gas. And I'm just interested both in that and then whether that vitality is leads to other things. And Jennifer, in your world, in the kind of global world out there, it's just, I don't know why we're not doing more with that. We think about global supply chains. We talk about the strength here. Why we're not doing something more on the transatlantic side with European allies. But let me ask you, Karen, what has this done to the map of economic possibilities in the country from your perspective?
You mean the new development and fracking, hydraulic?
Yeah, you go to Fargo, you go to, not that Fargo was a bad, Fargo had a movie about it, but Fargo right now is extraordinarily different. But you go to a lot of places in the country.
Well, yes, pockets of Pennsylvania and Ohio, that I've driven through 20 years, and you just see, just amazing changes in these areas. And, it's extraordinary in terms of the opportunity that it has brought these areas and the revival of some of these areas that were, like you said, considered dead. And also, like you mentioned, the Dakotas, where, where you look at sort of where the population has moved in the past, right, from the north to the south, and maybe from high tax states to low tax states. But when you have this type of economic development, in a particular area where, there really had to be something else to sort of more of an appeal or something there to attract new businesses, new people, for jobs. And that's the type of difference that this has made in many areas of the country. And I got it. And also for the states, in terms of tax revenues and what that means for, quality of life, better schools, better infrastructure, the list goes on.
Well, I think one of the things that I just don't want to gloss over here too is it just has always made me wonder is, can you have zones of revival like that and get the environmental equities right for families' livability? It's a controversial, maybe more tension in that than we're getting into, but it raises the question. So I see these communities struggling with it, but if they didn't have that option, dead is probably an overstatement, but stagnant and left behind probably is an accurate statement, right, Karen?
Yes. And, the good news is, well, you're right. That type of development, and particularly fast development, right? It really does hit an area quite hard and causes some disruptions. But on the other hand, you do have, the resources, the tax resources, the tax base, the other resources that, that can be utilized and directed to help, resolve some of those challenges. Right.
Well, Jennifer, let's talk about the transatlantic side of this thing, because we were talking a little bit about Russia's brinkmanship, with Ukraine, with Europe. Are we doing enough with our transatlantic friends? They're still friends to me. I don't know. We'll have to listen to the convention this week to see where they are on the other fronts. But in that, with allies that we have, with NATO nations, with nations that we are military allied with, are we doing what we can to kind of maintain strong, tight energy networks with them?
I should say, Steve, they're still friends to me as well. So, I think we can always do more with our partners and allies to build those kinds of ties. One thing, though, that I want to mention is, we've been talking about this idea of the United States being a net exporter of energy, as if this is, the lofty goal that we're all striving for. And, I think you can accomplish energy security in a number of different ways that may or may not include being a net energy exporter. So sometimes it may make sense to import energy as well, which is where I think, in a lot of ways, Europe or Canada, come in. There's an example of in the U.S. Gulf Coast, it may make the most sense to export gasoline to Mexico instead of using it, shipping it back up to the East Coast. And then the East Coast, in turn, will import its gasoline from Europe. And that's all fine, as long as those trade relationships are solid.
And do you think they are solid? Because one of the things we've seen in the world right now is not exactly a flowering of global trust. We're having pressure on supply chains, more discussion about bringing much manufacturing capacity and various strategic dependencies back into the United States. I think that will be part of the convention discussion we hear over this week. So do you think, as you talk about that framework of global relationships, is the environment such that that can thrive, or is that system under duress?
I mean, I think it can always be improved. And I certainly think that there have been, moments of transatlantic tension, tensions with our allies over the last 4 years, that it would, be great to see those ameliorated in some way. And, another concern, too, to bring up is that we have to look at, not just whether we're a net exporter or importer or whatever, but what are the commodities that we are exporting, and then what are we importing? So if what we're exporting tends to be fossil fuels, but then we're importing materials for the clean energy transition, like batteries or solar panels from China, and we're so heavily dependent on China, is that also a problem? And I think that that's the flip side of having good trade relationships with our allies.
Thank you for that. Paul, how do you look at that global map of how we're using our national security assets? And I assume that having some surplus of energy, no matter how you get it, whether it's listening to Janet, that's somehow an asset that can be used. Are we skillful, or do we still need to develop our tools a bit and using that as a national security asset in our foreign policy?
Sure. Well, I think there's no question, Steve, that it's an asset. I mean, it's far better to have those exports and, again, those revenues and everything else than not. I think I would suggest taking a step back and ask ourselves, why is it that we're now in a position to be exporting natural gas, that we're in a position to be exporting oil in ways that we haven't in the past? And the answer to that, of course, is technological innovation in those two industries that really transform the way that those two industries operate in the United States. So as I think about our leadership and our kind of geopolitical, economic, security, everything else position in the world, I really see that technological leadership as a core element of it. And, kind of looking on rankings of who exports what, that's a nice yardstick. But the real driver and the real area that I think we should be prioritizing is innovation. And Representative Flores, of course, mentioned advanced nuclear. That's certainly a key area where there's a lot to be done. There are other technologies, fuel cells, carbon capture, all kinds of other things where, similar kinds of innovations and leadership, could really make a great difference to the United States.
Thank you. Karen, you mentioned a moment ago the great diversity out there in the workforce among entrepreneurs, women and minorities. And I know that this is true because I've seen it out around the country when I've moved, and given talks in Dubuque, Iowa, Bartlesville, Oklahoma, Salina, Kansas. You kind of go around, you sort of see a different, which we don't often see in Washington or New York, press outlets. And so I'm interested in what those folks are feeling about the moment. Are they feeling optimistic? Are they feeling stressed out? Are they feeling left behind? What is the temperature of that part of the workforce right now, which I think we need to acknowledge, as you did, is part of the diverse dimension and inclusive dimension of the energy sector. But I can't imagine that they feel great at the moment. Like Bill Flores said, everybody feels bad, to a certain degree. But how do you see it?
A little bit of all the above, I would say. It's interesting because when I talk to business owners and entrepreneurs, they're feeling pretty stressed out right now. They've been challenged like never before, no matter what industry or sector they're in. And this is a difficult one to be in, the energy industry. But many of them, they have the capacity and the optimism, to pivot and to do different things and to, utilize, technology, I think, more to their advantage. I mean, that has been the silver lining of the pandemic for entrepreneurs and small businesses in general. More have had to turn to technological tools out of need, and they're which is now benefiting their firms greatly. It's helping them to reduce costs, getting them prepared to be on the other side, of the pandemic, hopefully, back to strong economic growth. So yes, it's a difficult time right now. But at the same time, and I know it sounds a little weird, but small businesses and entrepreneurs still happen to be optimistic because they feel they're in control, of their own destiny. And I think, but a lot always depends, Steve, on government policy and stability and certainty. And, is the government going to be raising taxes or increasing taxes, or is there going to be stability in terms of tax policy? And are we making efforts to continuously improve the regulatory environment? And some of those are some of the things that we've seen over the last few years, particularly as they impact the energy sector. Lower taxes, which has been good for all businesses, which helps drive investment. And of course, some of the regulatory changes, modernization of NEPA, for example, and other type of changes that have really helped to, I think, spur confidence and stability. But here we are right now during the pandemic, and I think more than ever, we need to have these pro-investment policies, stability in policies, as opposed to talking about, radical regulation or massive tax increases, which is not going to help businesses in this sector or any type of business, or the business sector in general in the United States.
Thank you for that. Paul and Jennifer, let me just ask both of you, similarly, in closing, if you were to be looking for a smarter energy policy, to Karen's point, energy policy picture this week, and want to hear certain things that you think advance America's interests, that shore up the energy picture, smart environmentalism, but kind of deal with global dimensions, I'm just interested in what would be the 2 or 3 points each of you are listening for in this week's speeches on whether or not the current Trump administration is doing what it can on the energy front. Paul?
Well, certainly, I think I'd like to see a big federal investment in energy innovation. I think that's important to driving a lot of these technologies forward. I mentioned already the role that innovation played for the oil and gas industries. And I would point out, that some of the key technologies that allowed us to pursue fracking and these other things that have really driven those industries forward, a lot of the original research there was federally funded research. So, first thing I would say innovation. Secondly, look, I think we have to have regulation. It's unavoidable. The energy sector is, certainly one of the most heavily regulated sectors of the economy, and I don't think that's fundamentally going to change. The key is kind of doing regulation right in ways that kind of work for all of the stakeholders involved. And doing it in ways that, help to kind of push this energy transition forward without creating an onerous burden. And finally, I would say, you got to do all of this in a bipartisan way. Because the only way to get stable and effective policy on any domestic issue is to do it in a bipartisan way. And it doesn't help our companies. As Karen has been talking about, if you have this completely unstable policy environment where, one administration wants this and the next administration wants that, and you're kind of constantly going back and forth and you don't know how to invest, you don't know how to run your business because you don't know, what the government is going to do next, or what, for that matter, kind of lawsuit is going to overturn your business strategy. So I think finding a bipartisan approach that settles a lot of these questions and creates an environment where companies can operate is also really key.
Thank you, Paul. Jennifer?
So I agree with Paul that I think that, innovation is so critical. And I think what we've seen over the past 4 years is that innovation, especially on technologies like nuclear energy and carbon capture, utilization, and storage, these have been ways or avenues for this administration in particular, I think, to come to the point of valuing low carbon energy technologies. And I think that that's really important. I think this is one of the most positive policy environments, maybe the most positive policy environment that we've ever seen on advanced nuclear. We've seen multiple rounds of bipartisan legislation pass through Congress successfully. And to speed innovation on nuclear, and just in the last year, the reauthorization of the Exim Bank, in the last month or so, the lifting of the DFC's ban on nuclear finance. So I think that, again, in terms of what we're watching this week, I want to hear more about specific technologies that are areas that have potential for innovation, and where the policy environment, can really support us getting to low carbon technologies.
Well, thank you for that.
Steve, can I add one to that?
Yeah, I was going to ask you a question, but you go ahead and add it. Yeah, go ahead.
Just really quickly, one of the areas, too, where we'd like to see some certainty and stability, and also strong voice on just continued global leadership on trade and trade agreements. I think that's very important to this industry, but all industries. We need to continue to develop these trade partnerships and cut trade agreements with many countries, across the board. That's going to be just terrific for this industry, both in terms of exports and imports as well. If you look at the EU, for example, since 2016, when we started exporting LNG, they went from 0 imports of US-based LNG to 3 billion cubic meters. So, you have, and that's cutting into Russia's market share. So you have the market itself, the global US energy markets. There's just so many other possibilities for US energy, again, if we do have this leadership on trade.
Well, I really appreciate you saying that, Karen, because I've recently talked to legislators from Louisiana, from Texas, about LNG facilities, about the need for new investment, which is very hard to make unless you have a secure policy environment, right? So, so I look forward to hearing those notes as well. I'll share you with, I usually just wrap this up, but I'm going to share you one little anecdote. It's interesting. Before the Obama administration came in, Paul, and some of you may remember, I was at the New America Foundation. I ran the American Strategy Project there. One of the pillars of the American Strategy Project was to look at how to smartly achieve energy independence. And that was a combination of, smarter management of oil and gas and LNG, development of renewables, of smarter nuclear, of technology advancement and innovation, and it was all of that. And the Obama administration kind of put energy independence early on its website. And folks I knew in Saudi Arabia, knew the kind of political leaders there, were very upset about that. And it raised to me the interesting sense that the rest of the world is paying attention to whether or not America has that muscle and that ability to maintain a lack of dependence on energy from other sources, however it does. And that involves both conservation and smart management and innovation and all the things you've said. I'm really, really grateful to all of you. Jennifer Gordon, Paul Saunders, and Kerrigan, thank you so much for your insights today, and look forward to coming back again.